At 75, I still wake some mornings with the phantom sensation of 13-year-old hands tearing at my nightgown, and the sound of thunder that once masked my desperate cries. But time has taught me that some stories must be told not to reopen wounds, but to prevent them from festering in silence. This is mine, a story of friendship turned to betrayal of family secrets that poisoned generations, and of the long, difficult journey toward healing and truth. My name is Eleanor Patterson, though most people called me Ellie growing up. I was born in 1940 on a failing farm in western Kansas, where the Great Depression's shadow stretched long across endless wheat fields and broken dreams. This is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the people who promise to protect you become the ones who hurt you most, and how speaking the truth, no matter how painful, can finally set you free. I was 8 years old in 1948 when I first understood that some houses hold more darkness than others. Our farmhouse sat on 40 acres of dust and desperation, where my father, John Patterson, fought a losing battle against drought debt and his own demons. The building itself was barely more than a wooden shack with cardboard stuffed between board gaps and a tin roof that drummed like machine gun fire during storms. "Ellie, come help me with this washing before the lye soap eats clean through my hands." Mother called from our tiny kitchen, her voice interrupted by those terrible coughing fits that sprayed blood across already stained handkerchiefs. "Coming, Mama." I'd answer, abandoning whatever small pleasure I'd found, usually a torn book from the traveling library or cornhusk dolls I'd fashioned myself. Mary Patterson was dying of tuberculosis, though nobody in our family spoke that word aloud. The disease carried shame in our tight-knit farming community, marking a household as weak and unclean. She'd been beautiful once I'd seen the faded photograph on her dresser, but illness had hollowed out her cheeks and turned her skin the color of old parchment. Father worked our failing wheat fields from dawn to dusk, his shoulders permanently bent under the weight of debts that grew faster than crops in our drought-stricken soil. At 35, John Patterson looked 50, his face weathered by sun and disappointment, his hands scarred from years of coaxing life from unforgiving earth. "This goddamn land used to feed 3 families proper," he'd mutter during his evening examinations of withered stalks that barely reached his knees. "Now look at it. Wouldn't grow weeds if you fertilized it with gold dust and prayers." When collection notices arrived in our battered mailbox, when men in city suits appeared at our door with legal papers and stern faces, Father would retreat to the barn with mason jars of homemade whiskey that burned like liquid fire going down. He'd emerge hours later with devils dancing behind his bloodshot eyes, looking for someone to blame for his failures. Where's my supper, Mary?" he'd demand, though it might be only mid-afternoon, his words slurred but sharp enough to cut. "Can't a man expect decent food in his own house after breaking his back in them fields?" "John, please." Mother would whisper, her voice weak from another round of coughing. "Eleanor's doing her best with what we have. Times are hard for everyone, not just us." "Hard." His laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Hard don't begin to describe what we're living through. And her best ain't worth the food she wastes. Look at her, skinny as a fence post, weak as a newborn calf. What good is she to anybody in this condition?" I learned to read the warning signs in those early years, the particular clench of his jaw, when frustration built to dangerous levels, the way his hands trembled, not from weakness, but from rage barely contained. When those signs appeared, I'd make myself small and invisible, hoping to escape notice until the storm passed. But even in our house of sickness and fury, I found salvation in an unexpected place. Tommy Hartwell lived on the adjacent farm with his mother, Sarah, a quiet woman who took in sewing and laundry to survive after Tommy's father died in a threshing machine accident when Tommy was 6. I met Tommy on my first day at the one-room schoolhouse that served children from 6 farms in a 3-mile radius. He was 9 years old to my 8, with wheat-colored hair that caught sunlight and eyes the color of summer sky. While other children clustered in established groups talking about things I didn't understand, Tommy approached my desk with easy confidence. "You're the new Patterson girl," he said, not as a question, but as a friendly observation. "I'm Tommy Hartwell. My ma and I live next farm over from yours." "Eleanor?" I managed, suddenly shy under his direct gaze. "But most folks call me Ellie." Ellie." He tried out my name, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth, rolling the syllables around thoughtfully. "I like that. Simple but pretty, like morning glory flowers. You know, the blue ones that grow wild along fence lines? They're not fancy garden flowers, but they're real beautiful if you take time to notice them properly." From that moment, we were inseparable. During recess, while other children played games, I didn't know or whispered about subjects that made me feel even more isolated. Tommy and I would sit under the old oak tree behind the schoolhouse, sharing stories and dreams that seemed as vast as the prairie sky. "Race you to Miller's Creek," he'd shout during our walks home from school, his laughter echoing across empty fields as we ran through stubble and dust. The creek was usually dry except during spring floods, but Tommy had imagination enough to populate it with fish and adventures that made even the driest season seem full of possibility. We shared everything in those innocent days, lunches of cornbread spread with large dreams of escape from the endless prairie secrets, too precious for adult ears. When older boys like Jake Peterson and his gang cornered me about my patched dresses and bare feet, Tommy's intervention was swift and fierce. "You leave Ellie alone, Jake?" he warned one autumn afternoon, his small fists clenched with surprising determination for a 9-year-old. "She's got more brains in her little finger than you got in your whole thick skull." "Ooh, Tommy's got a girlfriend." Jake sneered, his followers giggling like the pack of hyenas they were. "Your girlfriend's uglier than a pig's backside and twice as dirty. Bet she smells worse too." I felt my cheeks burn with shame, wanting nothing more than to disappear into the ground. But before I could shrink away, Tommy stepped forward. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, he faced them without flinching. "Say that again," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that made Jake's smirk falter. "I dare you to say one more mean thing about her." Jake must have seen something in Tommy's eyes that warned him not to push further. He and his followers slunk away, muttering insults under their breath, but unwilling to face a real fight with someone who clearly meant business. "Thanks," I whispered as we continued walking home, my voice barely audible over the wind, rustling through dying cornstalks. "Best friends stick together," Tommy said, simply reaching out to squeeze my hand with rough but gentle fingers. "Always and forever, no matter what happens." That's a promise I'm making to you right now, and I don't break promises to people I care about. Those words would echo in my mind for years afterward, twisted into something I couldn't have imagined on that innocent afternoon, when friendship felt like the most natural thing in the world. But even in those early days, there were signs I should have noticed, pieces of a puzzle too complex for a child's mind to assemble. The way Tommy's mother Sarah watched my father during Sunday church services, her pale blue eyes following John Patterson's movements with an intensity that seemed strange for casual neighbors. Her gaze would linger on his profile during hymns, and sometimes I'd catch her watching him with an expression I couldn't interpret, part longing, part anger, part something else entirely. The mysterious letters Mother kept hidden were another piece I couldn't fit into any pattern that made sense. She stored them in an old coffee tin tied with a faded blue ribbon and tucked beneath her mattress when she thought nobody was looking. Sometimes, late at night, when Father was passed out drunk and she thought I was sleeping, I'd hear her crying while she read those letters by candlelight. One evening, as I helped Mother sort through her few precious possessions during one of her better days, I noticed a silver hairpin decorated with tiny pearls, far too fine and expensive for someone in our circumstances. Mama, where did this come from?" I asked, holding it up to catch the lamplight. The pearls gleamed with a luster that spoke of better times, of a world beyond our poverty and struggle. Mother's reaction was swift and telling. She snatched the pin from my hands, her pale cheeks flushing with something that looked like guilt mixed with panic. "It was a gift," she said curtly, tucking it back into her jewelry box with trembling fingers that betrayed more emotion than her voice revealed. "From long ago, before I was married to your father." "From who was it? From Grandma before she died?" "Never you mind, child. Some things are better left in the past where they belong. Some gifts carry too much history to be talked about." But I caught her looking at that hairpin sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching, her expression complicated by emotions I was too young to understand. She'd hold it up to the light, turning it this way and that, as if trying to read secrets in its surface. Years later, I would realize it had belonged to someone else entirely. Someone whose very existence was a family secret that would eventually destroy us all. During those early years of friendship with Tommy, I began to notice other oddities that didn't quite fit the normal patterns of rural life. The way Sarah Hartwell's face would tighten whenever Father stumbled past their pew in church reeking of weekend whiskey. She'd grip her hymnal until her knuckles went white and her singing voice would falter when he was near. The careful distance she maintained from him was another puzzle piece. At church socials or community gatherings, Sarah would position herself as far from Father as possible, always keeping other people between them like a buffer. If he approached to make polite conversation, she'd find excuses to leave quickly, her usual composure cracking just enough to reveal something like fear underneath. Most puzzling of all were the monthly trips Father took to town, trips that always left him darker and more violent upon his return. These weren't ordinary supply runs or business meetings. He'd leave early in the morning, usually on the first Saturday of each month, and come back late at night in a mood that made the whole house feel dangerous. "Where does your pa go on those Saturdays?" Tommy asked me one summer day as we sat fishing in Miller's Creek with bent pins and string, hoping to catch the few minnows that survived in its muddy waters. "To town, I guess, for supplies and such." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Father never brought back supplies from these trips, and he was always secretive about his destinations. Tommy's blue eyes studied my face with unusual intensity for a 9-year-old. "Ma says your pa visits people in town, people he knew before he married your mama. Old friends or something like that?" Something cold settled in my stomach at his words, though I couldn't have explained why. "What kind of people?" But Tommy just shrugged his attention, apparently wandering back to the fishing line. "Don't know. Grown-up stuff, probably. Ma just says some folks have complicated histories that children shouldn't worry about." I filed that conversation away with all the other strange little mysteries that surrounded our families. In hindsight, I realized Tommy knew far more than he was letting on even then. But children accept the world as they find it, and I was too young to understand that some secrets are dangerous enough to destroy entire families. As autumn turned to winter in 1948, my friendship with Tommy deepened into something precious and necessary. While home remained a battlefield between Father's rages and Mother's increasing weakness, my time with Tommy became a sanctuary where I could simply be a child without worrying about adult problems I couldn't control. We carved our initials into the bark of the old oak tree behind the schoolhouse, making solemn promises about being best friends forever. The ritual felt important and permanent, like we were writing our names in history itself. We created elaborate fantasy games where we were explorers discovering new lands, or brave knights rescuing people from dragons that looked suspiciously like the adults who made our real lives difficult. In Tommy's imagination, I was always the princess worth saving, and he was always the hero strong enough to do it. Looking back, I can see that even at 9 years old, Tommy's attachment to me carried an intensity that went beyond normal childhood friendship, but at the time, I was simply grateful to have someone who cared about me. "When we grow up," he told me one snowy December afternoon as we huddled together for warmth under the oak tree, sharing a single threadbare blanket he'd brought from home. "I'm going to buy us a big house in the city. Somewhere far away from here where nobody knows our business and we can be happy all the time. Both of us." I asked, surprised by the certainty in his voice and the way he talked about our futures as if they were automatically connected. Course, both of us. We're best friends, aren't we? Best friends stick together no matter what happens. That's more important than anything else in the whole world. Looking back now, I can see that even at 9 years old, Tommy's attachment to me carried possessive undertones that should have been warning signs. But at the time, I was simply grateful to have someone who saw value in the skinny girl with patched clothes and bruises she tried to hide. If I had known then what I know now about the dark currents flowing beneath our innocent friendship, would I have run? Would I have found some way to escape the tragedy that was already taking shape around us? Like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. I'd like to think so. But children don't get to choose their circumstances, and I was already too trapped by my family's poverty and secrets to imagine any other kind of life. The web was being woven around me thread by thread, and I was too young and too desperate for friendship to see the pattern taking shape. By 1950, when I was 10 and Tommy 11, the cracks in our respective families had begun to show more clearly, like fractures in a foundation that had never been solid to begin with. Father's drinking had escalated beyond weekend binges to daily maintenance doses that kept him functional during farm work, but perpetually volatile in all other interactions. The farm continued its slow death with crop yields dropping year by year, despite his increasingly desperate efforts to coax life from soil that seemed cursed. Mother's tuberculosis had progressed to the point where she spent most days in bed, her breathing so labored that each inhalation seemed like it might be her last. The disease had stolen not just her strength, but her voice, reducing her to whispered communications that often dissolved into coughing fits that left bloody handkerchiefs scattered around her bedside like fallen petals. Ellie. She wheezed one cold February morning, gesturing for me to come close to her bedside, where the light was better, and she wouldn't have to strain her voice. There are things you need to know about our family, about your father and the choices he made before you were born. I leaned in closer, my 10-year-old heart racing with the possibility that she might finally explain some of the mysteries that surrounded our household. But before she could continue, another coughing spell overtook her, and when it finally subsided, she'd slipped back into exhausted sleep. I waited by her bedside for hours, hoping she'd wake and finish what she'd started to say, but the moment never came. It was during this period that I began to notice subtle changes in Tommy's behavior. Small shifts that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later reveal their true meaning. His protectiveness toward me intensified beyond what seemed normal for childhood friendship, and his questions about my home life became more probing and specific. "Does your pa hurt you?" he asked one day as we walked home from school, his voice casual but his eyes sharp with attention that felt almost adult in its intensity. I was so startled by the directness of his question that I stumbled over my own feet, nearly dropping the few books I carried. "What do you mean? I mean, does he hit you? I see bruises sometimes on your arms and legs, and you flinch when people move too fast near you like you're expecting to be struck." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. I had developed a habit of constant vigilance, always watching for signs of impending violence, always ready to dodge or flee at the first hint of danger. But admitting the truth felt like betraying family secrets that were mine to keep sacred trusts that children were supposed to protect. "I'm just clumsy." I lied, not meeting his eyes while I spoke. "Always walking into things or falling down. You know how it is." Tommy stopped walking and grabbed my arm gently but firmly enough to make me face him. His blue eyes, usually so full of easy humor, were serious in a way that made him seem older than 11. "Ellie, you don't have to lie to me. I'm your best friend. Remember, I want to help you, but I can't do that if you won't tell me what's really happening." The sincerity in his voice almost broke my resolve to remain silent, but years of conditioning held firm. Father's warnings about family business staying within family walls had been beaten into me, sometimes literally, and the fear of making things worse kept my mouth shut. "There's nothing to help with Tommy. Everything's fine at home, just like it is everywhere else." But Tommy's expression suggested he saw right through my deception and something in his face shifted from concern to something harder and more calculating. "If anyone ever hurts you, and I mean anyone at all, you tell me, okay, I'll make them sorry they were ever born." The fierce protectiveness in his voice should have comforted me, but something about his intensity made me uncomfortable. At 11, Tommy was already showing signs of the physical strength he'd possess as a man, and there was something unsettling about the way he talked about making people sorry. His hands had clenched into fists while he spoke, and I caught a glimpse of something almost violent in his expression. Meanwhile, my relationship with the rest of the community continued to deteriorate as word spread about our family's problems. Our reputation had suffered from father's public drinking and mother's shameful illness, and people whispered when they thought I couldn't hear their voices carrying easily in the thin air of our prairie town. Poor little Patterson girl. I overheard Mrs. Henderson say to Mrs. Clark at the general store, their voices pitched low, but not low enough. "Living in that house of sin and sickness. It's no wonder she looks half wild most of the time. Mary Patterson brought that tuberculosis on herself." Mrs. Clark replied with the certainty of the ignorantly judgmental. "Living in filth and not taking proper care of her health. Disease like that doesn't just happen to decent folks. Now the whole family's tainted by it." Their words stung more than I cared to admit, but they also hardened something inside me that had been soft and hopeful. If the community was going to judge us anyway, there was no point trying to win their approval or acceptance. I withdrew further into my friendship with Tommy, who remained steadfast in his loyalty even as others turned away. It was around this time that Miss Harper arrived to teach at our one-room school. She was different from any teacher we'd had before, younger, more idealistic, with genuine concern for her students that went beyond academic achievement and extended into their personal lives. "Eleanor," she said after keeping me in during recess one day, her voice gentle but probing. "I've noticed you seem tired lately and your attention wanders during lessons. Are you getting enough sleep at home?" I shrugged, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to explain that sleep was a luxury I rarely enjoyed, given Father's tendency toward late-night rampages and Mother's increasingly frequent coughing spells that echoed through our thin walls. "You know," Miss Harper continued, carefully settling into the chair beside my desk, rather than towering over me like most adults did when they wanted information, "if there are problems at home, problems that make it hard for you to do your schoolwork or get proper rest, there are people who might be able to help." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. She seemed genuinely kind, and unlike the other adults in our community, she didn't look at me with pity or judgment. Her brown eyes were warm with concern that felt real rather than performative. But the habits of secrecy were too deeply ingrained, reinforced by years of Father's warnings about what happened to children who couldn't keep their mouths shut about family business. "I'm fine, Miss Harper." I said the lie coming automatically despite the part of me that wanted desperately to confess everything. "Just tired from helping with chores and taking care of Mama." She studied my face for a long moment, her intelligent eyes clearly seeing more than I wanted to reveal. "Well, if you ever need someone to talk to about anything at all, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have a friend who's not involved in your situation." I nodded, though I had no intention of taking her up on the offer. In my experience, adults who promised to help usually made situations worse rather than better, and I couldn't risk making Father angrier than he already was. But Miss Harper's kindness made an impression that would stay with me for years. Unlike other teachers who seemed to view students as burdens to be endured until the school day ended, she treated us like real people with thoughts and feelings worth considering. She lent me books from her personal collection, encouraged my interest in reading and writing, and never made me feel ashamed of my family's circumstances. "You have a fine mind, Eleanor," she told me one afternoon as I helped her clean the blackboard after school. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Education is the one thing nobody can take away from you, no matter what else happens in your life." Her words planted a seed of possibility I hadn't known existed. Maybe there was a way out of the trap I'd been born into. Maybe learning could be my escape route from a life that seemed predetermined by poverty and violence. Tommy noticed my growing attachment to Miss Harper and didn't seem to like it, though he was subtle about expressing his disapproval. "She's filling your head with nonsense," he said one day, as we walked home from school, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "All that talk about education and bettering yourself. What's wrong with staying here where people care about you?" "Nothing's wrong with it," I said, though privately I disagreed. The idea of spending my entire life in this failing farming community surrounded by people who judged my family's struggles felt like a prison sentence. "I just like learning new things. Learning's fine, I guess. But don't forget what's really important." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his blue eyes intense with emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Don't forget that I'm the one who's always been there for you. I'm the one who'll always protect you no matter what happens." The possessiveness in his voice made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't have articulated why at the time. At 10, I was too young to recognize the warning signs of unhealthy attachment, too inexperienced to understand that protection could become its own form of prison. "I won't forget, Tommy," I said, hoping to ease whatever worry was driving his intensity. "We're best friends forever, remember. That's what we promised." But even as I spoke the familiar words, something felt different. The easy, innocent friendship of our earlier years was shifting into something more complex and potentially dangerous. Tommy was changing as he entered adolescence, his child's affection transforming into something that felt more like ownership than caring. That winter brought the worst blizzard in 20 years, trapping families in their homes for days at a time, while temperatures dropped to levels that killed livestock and froze water lines solid. Our house, never well built to begin with, proved woefully inadequate against the storm's fury. Snow blew through gaps in the walls, and the temperature inside dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of our windows. Father's response to being trapped with his dying wife and disappointing daughter was predictable and terrifying. He drank steadily throughout the 3-day storm, his mood growing darker with each passing hour as the walls seemed to close in around him. "This is all your fault." He snarled at me on the second day, his words slurred, but his aim with the empty bottle accurate enough to leave a bruise on my shoulder when I didn't duck fast enough. "Worthless mouth to feed, taking up space. We ain't got breathing air that costs money we don't have." When words weren't enough to express his fury, he found other ways to punish me for crimes I didn't understand. He locked me outside in the storm for several hours, forcing me to take shelter in the barn while snow piled against the doors and wind cut through my inadequate clothing like knives made of ice. By the time he allowed me back inside, I was hypothermic and barely conscious, my lips blue, and my hands so numb I couldn't feel my fingers. It was only Mother's weak protests from her sickbed that saved me from spending the entire night outside, which would certainly have killed me. "John, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind howling through our inadequate walls. "She's just a child. Just a little girl who doesn't understand what she's done wrong." "Child my ass," he replied, but he did unlock the door and allow me to stumble inside more dead than alive. "She's old enough to know better than to waste food and take up space where she ain't wanted." When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, I saw a familiar figure breaking trail through the deep snow toward our house. Tommy had fought his way across the drifts between our farms, his face flushed with cold and what appeared to be genuine concern. "Ellie!" he called out when he spotted me through the kitchen window, his relief so obvious it was almost palpable. "Thank God you're alive. I've been worried sick about you for days." His relief seemed authentic, and for a moment I almost forgot about the possessive undertones that had begun to characterize our friendship. When he pulled me into his arms, ostensibly to warm me after my ordeal, part of me wanted to accept the comfort he offered. "I brought food," he said, pulling a wrapped bundle from inside his coat. "Ma sent soup and bread and some of her preserves. She figured you might need it after being trapped in here for so long." The generosity was real and desperately needed, but I was beginning to learn that Tommy's gifts often came with invisible strings attached. Nothing he did was ever completely selfless, and his kindness always seemed to create obligations I didn't fully understand. "That's very thoughtful of her," I said, carefully accepting the bundle, but remaining wary of what might be expected in return. "She cares about you, Ellie. We both do." His hands found my face, cupping my cheeks in a gesture that looked tender to anyone who might be watching, but made my skin crawl for reasons I couldn't identify. "We're the only ones who really understand what you're going through." The implication was clear. His family was my only source of support, and maintaining that support required continued compliance with expectations I was only beginning to recognize. It was a perfect example of how abusers create dependency in their victims, making themselves indispensable, while simultaneously being the source of greatest harm. As winter deepened, and my 10th birthday passed unmarked and uncelebrated, I began to understand that Tommy's version of friendship was different from what other children seemed to share. His attention was becoming suffocating in its intensity, his need to know everything about my thoughts and activities exhausting to manage. But I was too young and too desperate for any form of kindness to recognize the patterns that were forming around me, like invisible chains. The trap was being constructed piece by piece, and I was too grateful for Tommy's protection to see that he was also my captor. The year I turned 12 brought changes that would set the stage for everything that followed. Mother's tuberculosis entered its final phase, leaving her barely conscious most days, while father's drinking reached levels that bordered on the catastrophic. Our farm was failing completely now, with creditors circling like vultures and foreclosure notices arriving with the regularity of seasons. But it was the changes in Tommy that worried me most, though I lacked the vocabulary to articulate my concerns. At 13, he was developing the physical strength and presence of a young man, but his emotional attachment to me remained childlike in its intensity and increasingly disturbing in its possessiveness. Mrs. Henderson asked me to help her with some spring cleaning after school tomorrow. I told him one day, as we sat under our oak tree during recess sharing the meager lunch I'd managed to put together from kitchen scraps. Tommy's reaction was immediate and unsettling. His entire body tensed and his jaw clenched in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of father's pre-rage warning signs. "Why would you want to do that?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled, but his eyes flashing with something that looked almost like anger. "Because she's paying me 50 cents and we need the money at home. Mother needs medicine and father spent last week's money on whiskey, I know." Tommy's interruption was sharp. "But I don't like the idea of you working for other people. What if they take advantage of you?" "Tommy, it's just helping with washing windows and sweeping floors." What could happen? His blue eyes darkened with something I couldn't identify, but instinctively feared. "Plenty could happen. People in this town talk and they might get ideas about you being available for certain kinds of work." The way he said certain kinds of work made my skin crawl, though I didn't understand why. At 12, I was innocent of the implications he was suggesting, but something in his tone warned me that the world contained dangers I hadn't yet learned to recognize. "What kind of work?" I asked, genuinely confused. But Tommy just shook his head, his expression closed and angry in a way that ended the conversation without resolution. "Never mind, just be careful, okay? And if anyone tries anything with you, anything at all, you tell me right away." That afternoon, as I helped Mrs. Henderson wash her windows and sweep her floors, I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction, wondering what Tommy had been worried about. But Mrs. Henderson treated me with the same distant politeness she showed everyone paid me the 50 cents as promised, and sent me home with a jar of apple preserves for my family. When I told Tommy about it the next day, his relief was visible, but somehow excessive for such an innocent encounter. "See," I said, trying to lighten his increasingly dark mood. "Nothing bad happened. You worry too much about things that aren't really problems." "Maybe," he said, but his eyes remained troubled. and watchful. I just don't like other people having claims on your time. We barely get to spend enough time together, as it is what with all your responsibilities at home. The concept of someone having claims on my time struck me as odd. We spent hours together every day, walking to and from school, playing during recess, sitting together during lessons, sharing whatever food we could scrounge. What more could he reasonably want? But I was beginning to understand that Tommy's wants were different from normal friendship, even if I couldn't fully comprehend what that meant. His questions about my daily activities had become increasingly detailed, his interest in my thoughts and feelings almost invasive in its intensity. It was around this time that I began noticing things about the adults in our community that I'd been too young to understand before. The way certain women whispered when Sarah Hartwell walked by, their voices carrying undertones of judgment and speculation that suggested shared knowledge of something scandalous. The careful distance most men maintained from her, as if association with a widow might somehow compromise their reputations or marriages. But most puzzling was the way people looked when both Sarah and my father were present at church or community gatherings. There was tension in those moments, a collective holding of breath that suggested shared knowledge of something shameful or dangerous that everyone knew but nobody discussed. "Tommy," I asked one day as we sat by Miller's Creek attempting to catch the few minnows that survived in its muddy waters, "do you know why people act funny when your ma and my pa are in the same room?" Tommy's fishing line went still in his hands, and I saw his shoulders tense in a way that suggested my question had hit some kind of nerve. "What do you mean?" "I mean, they get all quiet and watchful, like they're expecting something bad to happen between them. And your ma always finds reasons to leave if my pa tries to talk to her after church." For a long moment, Tommy didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral in a way that told me he was hiding something important. "Grown-ups are weird about lots of things. I wouldn't worry about it if I were you." But I caught something in his tone that suggested he knew more than he was saying. The careful way he avoided my eyes, the slight tremor in his voice, these were signs I'd learned to recognize from living with Father's lies and evasions. "Tommy, do you know something I don't about our families? I mean," his blue eyes met mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When he spoke, his voice carried a warning that chilled me despite the warm afternoon sun. "I know lots of things you don't, Ellie. But some things are better left alone. Some secrets are kept secret for good reasons." That conversation marked a shift in our relationship that I couldn't quite define at the time. Tommy had always been protective of me, but now his protectiveness felt more like gatekeeping, as if he was deciding what information I was allowed to have, what experiences I was permitted to enjoy. When Miss Harper announced that she was organizing a school trip to visit the state capitol, I was thrilled by the possibility of traveling beyond our isolated farming community for the first time in my life. The idea of seeing buildings taller than 2 stories, of visiting a real library with more books than I could count, filled me with excitement I hadn't felt since childhood. But Tommy's reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. "I don't think you should go," he said flatly when I told him about the trip during our walk home from school. "Why not? It would be educational, and I've never been anywhere outside our county." "Miss Harper says there's a museum and a real library with thousands of books." "Exactly. You don't know anything about the world outside here. You could get lost or hurt or taken advantage of by strangers who don't care about your welfare." His concerns seemed wildly exaggerated for a chaperoned school trip involving a dozen students and 3 adult supervisors, but he was relentless in his opposition. Every day for a week, he found new reasons why the trip was a bad idea: the expense we couldn't afford, the time away from helping at home, the possibility that something might happen to Mother while I was gone. "What if she dies while you're off gallivanting around the city?" he asked one afternoon, his voice heavy with accusation. "What if your father needs you for something important, and you're not there because you wanted to see some fancy buildings?" Finally worn down by his constant arguments and Father's predictable refusal to pay for something so frivolous, I withdrew my name from the trip. Miss Harper's disappointment was obvious, though she tried to hide it for my sake. "I was looking forward to showing you the state library." she said quietly, her voice wistful in a way that made my chest ache with regret. I thought you'd enjoy seeing so many books in one place. Maybe we can arrange another opportunity someday. But Tommy's satisfaction when I told him I wasn't going was so complete and obvious that I realized how much my participation had genuinely worried him. His relief seemed disproportionate to the situation, as if my absence from town for 2 days would somehow threaten something vital to his well-being. "I'm proud of you for making the sensible choice," he said, his hand finding mine as we walked home from school the day after the trip departed. "Adventures are overrated anyway. The best things in life are right here with people who really know and care about you." But increasingly, I found myself wondering if Tommy's version of caring was the kind I actually wanted or needed. His attention was becoming suffocating in its intensity, his need to control my activities and relationships exhausting to manage. The summer I turned 12 brought a drought that withered our remaining crops and pushed Father's drinking to new and dangerous extremes. With no productive work to occupy his time and no income to ease his financial desperation, he spent entire days in the barn with his bottles emerging, only to rage at Mother and me about our various failures and inadequacies. "Worthless bitches, both of you," became his standard greeting when he stumbled into the house for meals he couldn't taste and conversations he couldn't follow. "Eating food we can't afford, breathing air that costs money. We ain't got taking up space that decent folks could use for something useful." Mother had grown too weak to respond to his verbal abuse, but I was becoming less tolerant of his cruelty. At 12, I was old enough to understand that his failures weren't actually our fault, that his violence was a choice, rather than an inevitable consequence of circumstances beyond anyone's control. One particularly brutal evening after Father had knocked over Mother's water glass and screamed at her for wasting what little we have, I found the courage to speak up. "She didn't mean to spill it," I said, my voice shaking but audible over his continued ranting. "She's sick. She can't help trembling when she tries to drink." Father's attention turned to me like a searchlight finding its target, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood freeze with terror. "What did you say to me, girl?" Fear flooded my system, but something stubborn in my nature refused to back down completely. "I said she can't help it. She's dying, and you're making everything worse by being cruel to her." The backhand that followed sent me sprawling across the kitchen floor, stars exploding across my vision as pain radiated through my skull like lightning. Father stood over me, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been satisfaction at finally having a target for his fury. "Don't you ever talk back to me again," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that promised worse consequences if I continued to defy him. "I brought you into this world, and I can take you right back out of it if you give me sufficient cause." That night, as I lay in bed, with my cheek swollen and throbbing, I heard Mother crying in the next room, weak, exhausted sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. The sound was worse than any physical pain Father had ever inflicted on me, because it represented the complete hopelessness of our situation. It was the next day that Tommy noticed my bruised face and demanded to know what had happened. When I tried to minimize the incident, his reaction was explosive in a way that both frightened and confused me. "Ah, that bastard hit you." His voice cracked with emotion that seemed disproportionate even for someone who cared deeply about me. "He actually hit you in the face where everyone can see it. Tommy, keep your voice down. People will hear you, and then everyone will know our business." But he was beyond caring about discretion or social propriety. "Good. Let them hear. Let everyone know what kind of animal your father really is." The fury in his eyes frightened me almost as much as Father's violence had. At 13, Tommy was already nearly as tall as a grown man, and his rage transformed his familiar features into something I barely recognized. You don't understand, I said desperately, trying to calm him before his anger attracted unwanted attention. If people find out, it'll just make everything worse. Father will blame me for embarrassing him, and then what, he'll beat you even more than he already does. Tommy's laugh was harsh and bitter, carrying tones I'd never heard from him before. Ellie, this can't continue. Somebody has to do something. The way he said somebody sent chills down my spine. Tommy, promise me you won't do anything stupid. Promise me you'll stay away from him. But this time, he didn't agree to my request. Instead, he studied my bruised face with an expression I couldn't read but instinctively feared. I can't promise that, Ellie. I can't just stand by and watch him hurt you anymore. That afternoon, for the first time in our 5-year friendship, Tommy walked me all the way home instead of saying goodbye at our usual parting place. When we reached our front gate, he stopped and studied our shabby house with an expression that made me deeply uneasy. Things are going to change, he said quietly, his voice carrying certainty that chilled me to the bone. One way or another, things are going to be different soon. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes warned me that I probably didn't want to know the answer. October 1953 arrived with unseasonable warmth that made the prairie shimmer like a mirage, as if the very air was holding its breath before winter's arrival. I had just turned 13, my body beginning the awkward transition from childhood to something I didn't yet understand, while Mother's tuberculosis had reached its final stages, leaving her unconscious more often than not. Father's drinking had escalated to levels that defied human tolerance. He would consume an entire mason jar of moonshine before breakfast, then maintain a steady intake throughout the day that kept him functional for basic tasks, but perpetually volatile in all human interactions. The farm had essentially ceased to exist as anything more than a place for him to store his misery and rage. It was during this period of family disintegration that I began to understand how completely isolated we had become from the broader community. Neighbors who had once offered occasional help now crossed the street to avoid us. Church members whispered prayers for our souls, but made no practical efforts to ease our suffering. Even Miss Harper's gentle attempts to help were hampered by the school board's warnings about inappropriate involvement in family matters. But Tommy's attention had intensified to fill the void left by everyone else's abandonment. At 14, he had grown tall and lean, his child's softness replaced by the hard edges that farm work carved into boys who survived Kansas winters. His protection of me had evolved from friendship into something more possessive and demanding. You look terrible, Ellie, he observed one Friday afternoon as we sat under our oak tree after school sharing the few nuts we'd managed to gather from its branches. When's the last time you had a decent meal? The question was uncomfortably accurate. With Father spending what little money we had on alcohol, and Mother too weak to prepare food, I had been surviving mainly on scraps and whatever I could forage from abandoned gardens around our failing community. I'm fine. I lied automatically, though my clothes hung loose on my increasingly thin frame, and my hair had begun falling out in small clumps from malnutrition. Tommy studied my face with that intense scrutiny that had become characteristic of him. No, you're not fine. You're wasting away, and your father doesn't give a damn about what happens to you. The bitterness in his voice when he mentioned Father was something new and troubling. Lately, Tommy's comments about my home situation had carried undertones of anger that seemed excessive, even for someone who cared about me as much as he claimed to. Maybe you should come stay at our place for a while, he suggested, his voice carefully casual, but his eyes watching my reaction with uncomfortable intensity. Ma wouldn't mind, and you could get some decent food and rest. The offer was tempting, but something about the way he made it raised alarm bells in my mind that I couldn't quite identify. I can't leave Mother. She needs me even if she can't always show it. Your mother's dying, Ellie. The bluntness of his words hit me like a physical slap. She's been dying for years, and there's nothing you can do to stop it or slow it down. But you don't have to die with her. Tommy, How can you say something so cruel? It's true, and you know it. You're killing yourself trying to take care of people who can't be helped, while the people who could actually help you are right here waiting. The way he said, people who could help you, made it clear he was talking primarily about himself, and the possessiveness in his voice triggered a warning instinct I didn't fully understand at 13. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I belong with my family whatever happens to them. Tommy's expression darkened in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Father's pre-rage warning signs. Your family doesn't deserve you, Ellie. They never have, and they never will. That evening, as I helped Mother sip water from a spoon, the only nutrition she could manage anymore, I found myself thinking about Tommy's words. Was I really killing myself for people who couldn't be helped? Was my loyalty to family just a form of self-destruction that would ultimately serve no one? But even if Tommy was right about the hopelessness of our situation, the idea of abandoning Mother in her final days felt like a betrayal I couldn't live with. Whatever sins Father had committed, she was innocent of everything except choosing the wrong man to love and trust. It was during one of these late-night vigils that Mother surprised me by opening her eyes and speaking with more clarity than she'd shown in weeks. Ellie, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind rattling our loose windows. Come closer, child. There are things you need to know before it's too late. I leaned down until my ear was nearly touching her lips, straining to catch her fading words. In my trunk, under the wedding dress, there's a metal box. Each word was an effort that left her gasping for breath. Letters from Sarah Hartwell about your father, about things that happened before you were born. What about Father, Mama? What kind of things? But the exertion had been too much for her weakened system. Her eyes fluttered closed, and her breathing returned to the shallow, labored pattern that indicated unconsciousness. I sat beside her bed for hours, hoping she would wake and finish what she'd started to tell me, but the moment never came. The next day was a Friday, and Tommy found me behind the schoolhouse during lunch break, tears streaming down my cheeks as I tried to process Mother's cryptic warning about secrets hidden in our house. What's wrong? He asked, settling beside me on the wooden steps with the easy familiarity of our long friendship. It's Mother. She tried to tell me something last night, something about letters from your mother. But she couldn't finish, and now I don't know what she meant or whether she'll ever be able to explain. Tommy went very still beside me, his body tensing in a way that suggested my words had struck some kind of nerve. Letters from Ma about what? Something involving Father. She seemed to think it was important for me to know, but she was too weak to get the words out. For a long moment, Tommy didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral in a way that immediately made me suspicious. Maybe you shouldn't go digging around in things that don't concern you. His tone surprised me. Tommy had never discouraged my curiosity before. If anything, he usually encouraged me to ask questions and seek answers to mysteries that puzzled me. Why not? If it involves my family, doesn't it concern me? Not everything that involves your family is meant for you to know, Ellie. Some secrets are kept for good reasons to protect people who might be hurt if the truth came out. The warning in his voice was unmistakable, but it only made me more determined to understand what Mother had been trying to tell me. Tommy, do you know something about letters between our mothers? His blue eyes met mine with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. I know lots of things, Ellie, but knowing something and talking about it are two different matters entirely. That conversation marked the beginning of a subtle shift in Tommy's behavior toward me. He became more watchful, more controlling of my time and activities. When I mentioned wanting to visit the town library to research something for a school project, he found reasons why the trip was unnecessary or potentially dangerous. When I expressed interest in joining the church youth group, he convinced me that I wouldn't fit in with the other girls. You don't need other people, he told me one afternoon as we sat by the dried-up creek bed throwing pebbles at targets we'd set up on the opposite bank. You have me and I have you. That's enough, isn't it? The question felt like a test, and I wasn't sure what answer he was looking for. Of course you're enough, Tommy. You're my best friend, and you always will be. But even as I said the words, I was beginning to realize that Tommy wanted something more than friendship from me, something I wasn't ready to understand, much less provide. It was on the last Friday in October that Tommy made the invitation that would change everything between us forever. "Ma's going to the church meeting tonight about hiring a new preacher," he said as we walked home from school, his voice carefully casual, but his manner suggesting nervous energy that hadn't been there before. "She won't be back until past midnight. Want to come over and keep me company? We could make popcorn and read those new comic books I got from Jimmy Miller's older brother." The invitation should have sounded perfectly innocent, and perhaps it was in that moment. But something in Tommy's manner, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before, made me hesitate. "I don't know. Mother's been worse lately, and I hate leaving her alone with Father when he's drinking as heavily as he has been." "Your father passed out in the barn an hour ago," Tommy said, and I realized he must have been watching our house to know that detail. "And your mother, Ellie, she's not going to know whether you're there or not." The cruel accuracy of his observation stung, but it was also undeniably true. Mother spent most of her time unconscious now, and Father's drinking had reached levels that kept him insensible for hours at a time. "Come on!" Tommy pressed his hand, finding mine with familiar warmth that now carried undertones I didn't like. "When's the last time we had a whole evening to ourselves, just the two of us, like old times?" The wistfulness in his voice reminded me of the innocent friendship we'd once shared, and I felt a pang of nostalgia for those simpler days when Tommy's attention had felt like a gift, rather than a burden I had to carry. "I suppose a few hours wouldn't hurt," I said finally. "But I'll need to be home before Father wakes up, or there'll be hell to pay." Tommy's smile was radiant with satisfaction that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Of course. I'll walk you home whenever you want to go. I promise." That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon and the first drops of rain began to fall, I made the walk to the Hartwell place that would divide my life into before and after. Tommy met me at the door with that familiar grin that had been my anchor through so many difficult times. "Perfect timing," he said, gesturing toward the approaching storm. "We'll be nice and cozy inside while the weather does its worst out there." His mother, Sarah, was indeed gone the house quiet, except for the sound of rain beginning to drum against the windows. Tommy had prepared for my visit with Carefresh popcorn in a bowl, 2 bottles of Coca-Cola he'd been saving, and the latest Superman comics spread across his bed. For the first hour, everything felt perfectly normal. We laughed over Superman's adventures, shared stories about our teachers, and made plans for Halloween that was still a few days away. It was like stepping back in time to our childhood when friendship was simple, and Tommy's attention felt like a precious gift rather than something that made me increasingly uncomfortable. But as the storm intensified outside, I began to notice changes in Tommy's behavior. He moved closer to me on his narrow bed, his presence more physical and demanding than it had ever been before. His comments about the comics took on undertones I didn't understand, and his eyes lingered on my face and body in ways that made me want to cover myself despite being fully dressed. "Ellie," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't identify but instinctively feared. "Do you ever think about the future? About us?" "What do you mean?" Tommy set aside the comic he'd been holding and turned to face me completely. His full attention focused on me in a way that made me want to look away. "I mean, do you think about what's going to happen when we're older? When we can make our own choices about our lives?" "I suppose. Sometimes I think about leaving Kansas, seeing what's beyond all these wheat fields and small towns." What if we left together?" The intensity in his voice made me look up from my comic with growing alarm. What if we went somewhere far away where nobody knows our history and we could be whatever we wanted to each other? The way he said, whatever we wanted to each other, sent chills down my spine, though I couldn't have articulated why. At 13, I lacked the experience to understand the implications of his words, but my instincts recognized danger. Tommy, we're still just kids. We can't make plans like that. I'm not a kid anymore, Ellie, and neither are you. His hand reached out to touch my face, his fingers tracing my cheek with a gentleness that somehow felt more threatening than any violence. Look at yourself. You're becoming a woman. A beautiful woman. I tried to scoot backward on the bed, but there was nowhere to go in the small room. Tommy, you're scaring me. Can we just read the comics like we planned? Don't be scared. I would never hurt you. I love you too much to ever hurt you. But even as he spoke, the words, his hands were reaching for me with an intention that my 13-year-old mind couldn't fully process, but my body recognized as dangerous. What happened next would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. But in that moment, all I could do was whisper his name like a prayer as my best friend transformed into my worst nightmare. The rain pounded against Tommy's bedroom window like fists demanding entry, creating a wall of sound that would muffle everything that happened in those terrible hours. Lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes, while thunder rolled across the prairie with a violence that seemed to echo the storm building inside the small attic space. Tommy's assault was methodical and brutal, destroying not just my body, but my faith in human decency. When it was over, he transformed from rapist back to concerned friend with terrifying ease, warning me about the consequences of speaking out while positioning himself as my only source of protection. This has to stay between us, he said as I struggled to clean blood from my torn dress. People wouldn't understand what we have together. They'd blame you for leading me on. The psychological manipulation that followed was as devastating as the physical assault. Tommy systematically isolated me from potential sources of help, while maintaining the facade of friendship that made his abuse appear consensual to outside observers. The months following that October night became a carefully choreographed performance of normalcy, while I slowly died inside. Tommy had constructed a perfect trap using our friendship as cover, while threatening me with social destruction if I spoke out. At 13, I lacked the vocabulary to understand what had been done to me or the resources to seek help. The physical healing took weeks, but the psychological wounds ran deeper than bone. I moved through my days like a sleepwalker, maintaining the pretense that Tommy and I were still close friends, while every interaction with him felt like poison in my veins. You've been quiet lately, Miss Harper observed one morning, her perceptive eyes studying my face with growing concern. Is everything all right at home? The kindness in her voice almost broke my resolve, but Tommy's warnings echoed in my mind. I'm fine, Miss Harper. Just tired from taking care of Mother. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her expression, but without concrete evidence of abuse, there was little she could do beyond offering support I was too frightened to accept. Meanwhile, Tommy's control over my life tightened like a noose. He monitored my interactions with other students, discouraged me from pursuing activities that might expose me to adult supervision, and maintained his position as my protector, while simultaneously being my greatest threat. It was the summer of 1955, when Mother finally succumbed to tuberculosis, that I discovered the truth about our families. Searching through her belongings, I found the hidden letters that revealed Tommy was my half-brother, the product of an affair between Father and Sarah Hartwell that had been covered up through years of blackmail. The revelation was devastating, but also illuminating. Tommy's assault hadn't been about desire. It had been about revenge against the father who'd abandoned him. I was nothing more than a weapon in his war against John Patterson collateral damage in a family conflict that predated my birth. Armed with this knowledge, I finally understood the twisted dynamics that had shaped our lives. Father's monthly trips to town, his increasing violence, Sarah's careful distance, it all made sense now. The biological connection that should have protected me had instead made me the perfect target for Tommy's rage. But knowledge without power is just another form of torture. Tommy was physically stronger, socially protected, and psychologically sophisticated in ways that left me feeling even more trapped than before. When I confronted him with what I'd learned, he simply incorporated it into his existing framework of control. "So, now you know the truth," he said with casual cruelty. "Does it change anything? You're still the bastard daughter of a drunk, and I'm still the only person in this world who cares what happens to you." The years that followed blurred together in a haze of ongoing abuse and manipulation. Tommy would assault me whenever opportunity arose, always with the same threats about exposure and social destruction. My world shrank until he was at its center, not by choice, but because he had systematically eliminated every other option. Father died without ever learning his son had been living a quarter-mile away, taking his secrets to the grave. Mother's death had removed the last barrier to Tommy's complete dominance over my existence. I was 17 and felt like my life was already over. Spring 1957 brought violent weather that seemed to mirror the storm building in my soul. I was 17, living alone on what remained of our farm, while Father recovered from a drinking-related injury in the county hospital. For the first time in years, I had space to think without Tommy's constant surveillance. The dust storm that changed everything began as a brown smudge on the horizon, growing into a towering wall of debris that would provide perfect cover for our final confrontation. I was securing loose items in our makeshift barn when Tommy appeared, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of friendship. "Hello, sister," he said, using our biological relationship like a weapon. "Thought you might want company with the storm coming." The confrontation that followed was brutal, but liberating. For the first time in 4 years, I fought back not just physically, but emotionally. When Tommy dragged me toward the railroad tracks with murderous intent, I found my voice in the most literal sense. "Tommy Hartwell raped me!" I screamed at the approaching freight train, my words carrying to the railroad workers despite the chaos. "My half-brother raped me!" Those words, spoken in desperation, finally broke the silence that had protected him for years. The witnesses in the train cars would spread my accusations across 3 counties, making denial impossible. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence witness testimony, the hidden letters documenting the blackmail scheme, my detailed account of years of abuse, Tommy confessed to everything. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while his mother Sarah received 5 years for her role in the extortion plot. The community's reaction was mixed, but I found unexpected sources of support. Ms. Harper returned from her new teaching position to testify on my behalf. Dr. Matthews provided medical evidence of old injuries. Most importantly, several other women came forward with their own stories of survival, creating a network of mutual support. Recovery from trauma is never linear or complete, but it is possible. With the truth finally exposed and my tormentor behind bars, I began the slow process of rebuilding my life from nothing but determination and hope. I used the money from selling our farm to start fresh in a town 3 counties away, where nobody knew my history. Working as a seamstress while attending night school, I slowly learned to trust again, first in small ways, then in larger ones. In 1961, I met James Morrison, a mechanic who'd moved to Kansas from Oklahoma after losing his own family in a car accident. He was patient with my fears, gentle with my limitations, and understanding about the nightmares that sometimes left me screaming in the darkness. "We all carry scars," he told me during one of our early conversations. "The question isn't whether we have them, it's whether we let them define us or teach us to be stronger." James and I married that same year, creating a partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding of loss. Our children, Hope, born in 1962, and Michael, born in 1964, grew up knowing the broad outlines of my story without being burdened by its graphic details. Parenthood brought new challenges as old traumas resurfaced, but it also provided powerful motivation for healing. I was determined that my children would grow up free from the secrets and violence that had defined previous generations of our family. Both Hope and Michael learned early that silence protects perpetrators, while speaking truth begins the process of healing. They grew up understanding that family loyalty never requires enduring abuse, and that seeking help is a sign of strength rather than weakness. My work with other survivors began in the 1970s and continued for decades. Through support groups, legal advocacy, and public speaking, I helped dozens of women find their voices and seek justice. The courage to testify in Tommy's trial had established legal precedents that protected other victims. In 1980, my testimony helped convict another predator who'd been abusing his stepdaughter for years. The case drew statewide attention, and my willingness to speak publicly about my experiences encouraged other survivors to come forward. Letters poured in from across the region, women sharing their own stories and thanking me for breaking the silence that had protected their abusers. The last major revelation in my family's twisted saga came in 2003 when advances in genetic testing revealed a final shocking truth. DNA analysis confirmed that Sarah Hartwell was not just Tommy's mother, but also my half-sister, another child abandoned by John Patterson decades earlier. The implications were staggering. Father hadn't just had an affair with Tommy's mother. He'd unknowingly entered an incestuous relationship with his own daughter, creating a son who was both my half-brother and my half-nephew. The family tree I'd been trying to understand was even more tangled than I'd imagined. This discovery explained the psychological dynamics that had created perfect conditions for tragedy. Sarah's complicated feelings toward father, her willingness to engage in blackmail despite genuine affection, her inability to protect her son from the violence that shaped him, it all made sense within the context of multi-generational abandonment and abuse. But understanding didn't excuse the choices that had been made or minimize the harm that had been inflicted. Tommy died in prison in 1967, stabbed by another inmate during a fight over cigarettes. Sarah died 2 years into her sentence, her health broken by stress and guilt. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only sadness for the waste of human potential and the unnecessary destruction of multiple lives. We were all victims of circumstances beyond our control, shaped by family secrets that had poisoned 3 generations. Now at 75, I understand that my story isn't defined by what was done to me, but by what I chose to build from the wreckage. The friendship that began with innocent laughter and carved initials became a nightmare of violence and betrayal. But it also provided the foundation for everything that followed. My children and grandchildren have grown up free from the cycles of secrecy and abuse that nearly destroyed our family. They know that speaking truth, no matter how painful, is the beginning of healing. They understand that silence protects perpetrators, while courage protects future victims. The greatest victory isn't that justice was served or that my abusers were punished. It's that the poison stopped with my generation. Hope became a social worker dedicating her career to helping other survivors. Michael opened a business that employs several people, contributing positively to his community. Their children are growing up with the knowledge that they have the right to be heard, believed, and protected. My work with survivors continues through the organizations I helped establish and the legal precedents my testimony created. Dozens of women have found the courage to speak out because they knew someone else had survived similar trauma and gone on to build meaningful lives. The scars remain physical reminders of battles fought and survived, but they tell a story of triumph rather than defeat, of healing rather than destruction. The boy who promised to be my friend forever became my worst enemy, but even that betrayal couldn't destroy my fundamental belief in the possibility of redemption through truth and courage. As I finish writing these words, the Kansas sun sets over farmland that no longer holds terror for me. The prairie that once seemed like a prison has become a symbol of endurance and hope. Seeds can grow in the harshest soil if they're given enough light and care. My friendship with Tommy truly did end forever that October night in 1953. But from its ashes grew something far more valuable, the understanding that we are not condemned to repeat the mistakes of those who came before us. We can choose a different path, build a better legacy, and transform our deepest pain into our greatest purpose. That is the real ending of our story, not the destruction of innocence, but the triumph of truth over lies, justice over silence, and love over hatred. The seeds of healing we plant today will bloom in gardens our children and grandchildren will tend, creating beauty from ground that once knew only darkness.